Charles Vane was sometimes Lord Rudgate, an Englishman of dim background and cryptic reference, and sometimes Strephon, a young mad I cussed in the sprig. I was alternately Dennis, a deceased painter who had specialized in gun dogs for the calendars of coal companies, and one McKinnon or McKenyon, an advertising executive who had attempted to deflower Miss Bell in a speeding motorboat during the panic of 1907. This was highly exasperating to such scholarly critics as Hudson Van Horn and Dantes Woodrow, and they never came back after their separate agonized hours in the underwater gloom of the echoing gray room. It is not congenial to me at this time to expose in detail how I became lost, if lost I became, in the brilliant wilderness of Chanda Bell's prose, or to reenact the process of equation, synthesis, and integration, by means of which I was able to reveal the subtle affirmation compounded of the double negative of her unmeaning and her unmethod. This was ably, if mistakenly still ably, set forth in my A Note on Chanda Bell, footnote, The Neutral Review, October 1943. Upon its publication, she had sent for me, and in the fine years of intellectual intimacy that followed, my faith in her genius was more often reinforced than not. It wasn't until the last few months when, by design or aberration, she began to discuss herself, between tea-time and twilight, as if she were discussing someone else, that the blackest of a critic's ravens, uncertainty of his soundness, came to dwell in my consciousness. It is a terrible thing not to be sure whether one has sought or been sought, not to be able to tell the hunter from the quarry, the sanctuary from the trap. Chanda Bell had in fact commanded me to her salon, but had I not asked for it, had I not commanded the command by the tribute of my unique and penetrating analysis of her work? She had cause to be grateful, and her summoning me to her side was, in my early opinion, the most natural of acts. Careless and churlish critics in malice or mischief had dismissed her bright and tangled intention with such expressions as bloom and drool, the amorphous richness of a thrown pie, as dull as daiquiris with the commodore of a yacht club, and as far to the right as a soup spoon. This last was the sheerest nonsense. One might as reasonably have said that she was as far to the left as a fish fork. The closest she ever came to mentioning politics was one day when, in a rare moment of merriment, she referred to Karl Marx as Groucho. I myself had heard the faint and special obligato of elfin horns in her work, and the laughter in the dusty house, and I alone had seen the swift and single flashing of a naked nymph by moonlight. It is hard to mark the hour and day when the thunderhead of suspicion first stains the clear horizon of an old admiration. But I came to be drenched in the horrid mental weather of last autumn by the downpour of a million doubts and dreads of Chanda Bell. I began to fear that she had perpetrated, in her half-dozen dense, tortured novels, one of the major literary hoaxes of our time, and to suspect that she had drawn me into the glittering web of a monstrous deceit, in order to destroy by proxy and in effigy the entire critical profession. We would sit in the gray room from 4 till dark. She had permitted me to sit at last with the compassionate concession of a queen, and she would pierce my thin armor of hope and prayer with sharp and studied flicks of her sardonic, allusive intelligence. "You have the scaffold touch of a brain certain," she told me one afternoon. This was in the best tradition of her infernal dialectic. I could figure, in accordance with her secret code, that I had the scalpel touch of a brain surgeon, or I could take her to mean, in perverted literalness, that I was doomed to die, and was about to, an awful death for my wrong and sinful certainties. "You have found the figure, Thurber," she told me one afternoon, "but have you found the carpet?" This was accompanied by her shrewd, tiny smile. I could not determine whether she meant there was something to find that I had not found, or nothing to find at all beneath the gleaming surface of her style. The devil of it was that I could not be sure of anything. I spent that night going over The Haunted Yacht with a fine-tooth comb, searching for esoteric anagrams, feeling for what she had called the carpet. I scrutinized, investigated, explored, took apart, and put back together again the entire fiber and fabric, uncertain of what shape and texture I was looking for. I read the thing backward. I even tried to read it upside down and in the mirror of my bureau. I copied out one disturbing sentence and carried it about with me for close study. Icing mellow moony on a post-gate dove's snow and love's surrender. Its once perspicuous feel meaning deserted me, and its cool loveliness became the chatter of a gibbon in my distraught consciousness. I could no longer tell whether it was beauty or balderdash. If it was balderdash, the book degenerated into the vivid cackling of a macaw, and my critique stood as a monument to a fatuous gullibility. Toward the end, Chanda began to talk about herself in the third person, as if she were not there in the house, but on her way to visit us. "I've asked her to tea," she would tell me, "but it will not astonish me if she fails to appear. Nobody has ever been able to pin her down." And she would study the effect of this upon me with her hooded gaze. She had lapsed into simple declarative sentences, and this was a comfort, but I was deeply perturbed by the feeling that her outlandish fantasy and her revelations were new and planned inventions of her cruelty. "Chanda, she said one evening, had an allowance of $200 a week while she was still in pigtails. Her father, the millionaire industrialist, doted on the awkward, big-eyed little girl. He would bring her curtsying into the library for his cronies to admire. 'By God, she'll be the first woman president of Standard Oil,' he exclaimed one night. He had a stroke when he discovered that she proposed to become a writer. 'By God,' he roared, 'I would sooner see you operate an unsuccessful house of ill repute.' At 14, a dreadful thing occurred. The small son of one of her father's gardeners sold 2 poems to the Atlantic Monthly, entitled Ruffian Dusk and The Strangler of Light. Chanda offered him $50 a week to write poems that she should sign and publish. The little boy coldly rejected the proposition, and his father, a stern Presbyterian, informed Chanda's father of the deal and how it had fallen through. 'By God,' the old man roared, 'at least she's not guilty of integrity, and that's more than I can say for any belle in 4 generations except my grandfather and myself.'" Miss Bell let her reminiscence trail off here, and she watched me from her divan with her penetrating eyes. "Ah," I said hopefully, "but she learned that day the high and holy importance of integrity, I trust." Chanda gave me her sign of dismissal, a languid lift of her left hand. "You are the critic," she said. "I am but the chronicler. Leave me now. You perceive she is not coming." I rose and bowed. Perhaps I blurted out, "There is no Chanda Bell," but she had closed her eyes and turned away. The next day they took her to the hospital. "I have a panther near my hearth," she said, the first time they let me call on her. I went to see her twice again, the last time with Charles Vane, who carried with polished hopelessness 2 bulging briefcases, which the nurse would not permit him to open. Chanda was wandering in a far land, but she contrived a faint smile for each of her visitors. "Dear Rudgate," she whispered to Vane, "what will become of meaning, thank God, when you are dead?" He tried in silence to make her grip a fountain pen, but she shook her head and turned to me. "Pretension has no plinth, Dennis," she said. "Ah, what a dusty answer." Her voice and her heart failed. and the most remarkable woman I have ever known was dead. That night I called at her house in the East 60s. Hadley let me in. I had suspected him for a long time of being joined in dark conspiracy with Chanda to make an end of me. I wondered, as I glared at the cold eye and then at the warm one, whether he might not be a frustrated writer, a bankrupt publisher, or an editor who had suffered a nervous breakdown. I jumped over the amenities of sorrow. Her dying request, I said, was that I should examine her papers. The eyebrow over his twinkling eye lifted. "This evening, sir?" he asked. "Take me to her desk and open it," I demanded. There was a full second's pause, then, "Certainly, sir," he said, and led the way into the gray room. "If I knew what you seek," he began. I turned on him. "I think you do," I snapped. "I am looking for proof of whether I am an egregious ass or a uniquely perceptive individual. The line is sometimes thinly drawn between a tranquil old age in this city and exile, say, in Nassau." He seemed genuinely bewildered. There was nothing in the desk except a large manila envelope which bore my name on the cover. I tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of white typewriter paper on which there were 3 carefully drawn squares, one inside another. "What does it mean?" I asked. "What is it?" "If you will permit me, sir," said Hadley, and he took the paper and studied it. "That, sir," he said finally, "is what I should describe as a drawing of a plinth." I seized him by the shoulder. "You are in on this," I cried. "What does it mean? What's behind it? Who are you? What have you two devils been up to all these years? Why should you want to destroy me?" He took a backward step and gaped. He was honestly frightened, or else he was a superb actor. There was no twinkle in his eye. "I do not understand, sir," he stammered, or seemed to stammer. I let go of his shoulder. "My critical reputation is at stake," I said. "Has she ever written an explanation of her writing, perhaps to be sent to some journal or periodical after her death?" Hadley appeared to frown. "That, sir, I could not say," he brought out. I turned away from him and then whirled back. "What is the carpet?" I shouted. He put several feet of the shiny floor between us. "I do not know what you mean," he said nervously. "Would there be papers anywhere else?" I demanded. He looked about the room. "Nowhere," he said hollowly. I walked over and looked out a window for a long time. Suddenly, Hadley began to speak. "She had promised to put me in one of her books," he said in a tone of sadness, or what came to my ears as a tone of sadness. Then his voice brightened. "I was to have been the uncharacter of the non-butler," he said. I came back from the window and glared at him. "Her phrase, sir," he added hastily. I lighted a cigarette, inhaled the smoke, and blew it out slowly. "Didn't you appear in any of her novels?" I asked. "Oh, but no, sir," he corrected me proudly. "I did not appear in all of them." It was as if Chanda were in the room, her bright, dark eyes taking us both in with a look of veiled amusement. "It must have made you very happy indeed," I snarled. "Not to appear in any of her books was wonderful enough, but not to appear in all of them. The final accolade, Hadley, the final accolade." He acknowledged it with a grave bow. "What has become of her manuscripts and her letters?" I demanded. Hadley put on a sad expression. "She burned them, sir," he said. "It was her last act in this house." I looked for the last time at the gray room, the gray desk, the gray chair, the gray Hadley. "Perhaps a glass of Madeira, Mr. Thurber?" asked the butler. I declined ungraciously and said that I must leave. At the door, with the welcome street so near and desirable, he coughed discreetly. "Do you wish to take this with you, sir?" It was the drawing of the plinth. I took it without a word. "If I may say so, sir," Hadley went on, "you were the closest of all of them." I glared at him, but there was no twinkle. "How close?" I growled. "Oh, very close, sir," he said. "Very close indeed." This time I thought I detected the ghost of the twinkle, but I could not be sure. I could not be sure of anything. It has been 8 months since I found the plinth in Chandabel's desk. Nothing has happened, but I expect an editor to ring me up any day. We've got a remarkable letter or manuscript here, apparently written by Chandabel, he will say, sent to us by her lawyer in accordance with a request in her will. It isn't signed, but he says she wrote it all right. Seems she never signed anything. Sort of laughter from beyond the grave, you might say. The old girl exposes her stuff as the merest junk. Proves her point, too. She takes a hell of a crack at your note on Chandabel. Thought you might want to read the thing and reply to it. We'll print you and her in the same issue. She calls the piece The Carpet for some reason. I'll shoot it along. No such call has come as yet, but I keep a bag packed, ready at a moment's notice to fly to Zanzibar or Mozambique or East Liverpool, Ohio. Meanwhile, I have hit on a new approach to the works of Chandabel. I am trying to read them sideways. There's a time for flags. Notes of a man who bought a curious Christmas gift. December 15th. Yesterday morning at 11 o'clock, I bought an American flag 5 feet by 3 and a white flagpole 18 feet high, surmounted by a bright golden ball, and now I am trying to figure out why. The incongruity of buying a flag and a flagpole in the middle of December as a Christmas present for my wife has begun to disturb me. True, the gesture is not so elaborate as that of the man in the madrigal, who gave his true love a partridge in a pear tree, 2 turtle doves, and more than 120 other gifts, counting the fifes of the 11 fifers and the drums and drumsticks of the 12 drummers, but it is approximately as hard to explain. When did the idea first come to me, or was it merely an idea? Could it be that I was seized by the stern hand of compulsion, that dark, unseasonable urge that impels women to clean house in the middle of the night, and men, or at least me, to buy flags in the dead of winter? As I write this, 24 hours have gone by since I bought the large flag and the enormous pole, but unlike every other purchase I have ever made, including my banjo mandolin and my Cadillac, the emblem and staff show no signs of dwindling to normal proportions in my consciousness. They occupy the whole landscape of my thought. Last night I woke up and thought about the 18-foot pole, realizing sharply the measure and magnitude of what I had done. I had bought, for the yard of my home, a flagstaff designed and intended for the grounds of an institution. Nothing smaller than a boys' school with an enrollment of 400 would think of ordering a pole of that heroic height. A flag for a private residence is supposed to be hung out of an upper-story window on a 5-foot pole. Great God, I said aloud. What is happening? Asked my wife without waking up. It was a good question. A searching wind, a whisper and a rumor. A wink of the eye, a shake of the head, high as his house, they say. Oh, say, ain't you seen? Every heart beats true to the red, white, and blues in the night. Where there's never a post or flag, and forever impede may you wade. I became furled at last in sleep. December 16th. I woke early this morning from a deep dream of flags and tried to remember when I first got the idea, or when the compulsion first got me. Did it go back to the quiet years in Washington, D.C. at the turn of the century, when I was fascinated by the miniature flags that came with packs of sweet Caporal cigarettes? Have I always had a secret desire to command a battleship, or own an office building, or become headmaster of a boys' school with an enrollment of 400? Am I intent on blowing psychological taps over the memory of one of those horrible captains of cadets at Ohio State University 45 years ago? If so, why didn't I buy a bugle? Oh, there must be some simpler explanation. Guilt, that's it. That's what it is. Guilt, the most powerful force in the life and psyche of the individual, more durable than love, deeper than fear. But guilt about what? What have I ever done that demands such a vivid and magnificent symbol of regret? I can think of nothing, except that as a boy I sympathized with the cause of the Southern Confederacy, and once announced in Miss McIlvain's 8th grade class at Douglas School that the South would have won the war if Stonewall Jackson hadn't been killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But this sin is surely not black enough to call for so large a flag and so long a pole. I continue to ponder the provenance of the purchase. December 17th. This is exactly what happened. I phoned Jack Howard about 3 o'clock on the afternoon of December 13th, was it only 4 days ago, and asked him if he would go shopping with me. There was a Christmas present I wanted to buy for somebody, a flag. A flag, he asked? You mean one of those clips? Not costume jewelry, I said. If I were shopping for that, I'd take a woman with me. I want to buy an American flag, a big flag. Oh, Jack said, and after a moment, sure, fine. When do you want to go? I can't make it this afternoon. I arranged for him to pick me up the next morning at 10:30 at my hotel in the West Forties. I had come to town 3 days before from my home in Cornwall, Connecticut, to buy to do my Christmas shopping. When Jack and I were in a cab the next day on our way to the famous Annan Flag Store at 16th Street and 5th Avenue, he said, "They're worried about you at my office." Well, not worried exactly, but interested. I didn't say anything. I told Chuck Nelson you were going to buy a flag, and he said, "What's he up to?" Jack laughed. "All you need to do now," he went on, "is to buy a record of the Stars and Stripes forever, and they'll have you up before the Un-American Activities Committee." He was right, and I was frightened. "I wish you hadn't told everybody," I said. "A thing like this can get all over town." I felt that he was studying my right profile. "Well, what are you up to?" he asked, with a laugh that didn't seem genuine. "I'm not up to anything," I said coldly. "I'm simply going to buy a flag. You don't have to go with me if you don't want to." "Forget it," he said. "I'll turn up my coat collar and pull down my hat. You call me Joe, and I'll call you Sam." I leaned back in the cab, trying to indicate that I didn't want to talk about it. He began to whistle George M. Cohan's tribute to Old Glory. Outside of the employees of the store, there was only one other person in Annan's when we got there. I realize suddenly as I write this that in retracing my steps I have come upon the small and simple solution of the case of the man who bought a flag in December. For some years now I have not been able to get around as well as I used to, especially in crowded stores at Christmas time. I remember now a rough experience I had last year in a store filled with fragile crystal and china objects, a store in which I had bought Christmas presents over a period of years. The last time I visited it, I distinctly overheard a clerk say, "Sweet God, here's that man again." I retreated from the store without buying anything, and fortunately without breaking anything. But the adventure had left its deep psychic scar. Subconsciously, since that day, I had been seeking an easy, a less perilous way out of my private shopping problems. My unconscious mind had found the answer. Hardly anyone would be shopping for a Christmas present in Annan's in December. I recall now that a line of verse written by Clinch Calkins 30 years ago had been running through my thoughts for months. The peril streamed through us like flags. By an easy process of association, the peril of shopping had been linked up with the word flags, and from there it was an even easier step for my mind to pick out the cathedral calm of the Annan store, as the perfect place for me to buy my wife's principal Christmas present. The lady who stepped up to wait on us was gracious, competent, and unsuspicious. After all, you must run into all kinds of people in a flag store. I see now that the flagpole was an afterthought. The 5x3 woolen flag that I decided on came to only $5, which didn't seem enough to pay for a gift. How about a 10x6, I asked the lady. You don't want a 10x6 flag, Jack said, not unless you own a skyscraper. It was then that the idea came to me of buying a pole, halyards and all, to go with the Star-Spangled Banner. I would like to look at a flagpole, I said. Certainly, said the lady, leading the way to the flagpoles. Who is this present for, Jack asked me. Eisenhower? It's for my wife. It's for Helen, I said. I had hold of his left arm, and I could feel him shrug, but he didn't say anything. There were flagpoles 6 feet tall, 12 feet tall, and on up. I finally selected an 18-foot pole, which came in 3 6-foot sections. The price, 6 times that of the flag, seemed to be suitable for a Christmas gift for one's wife. What do you think of it? I asked Jack. He sighed. It's your life, he said. Go ahead. Maybe an 18-foot flagpole is what Helen has always wanted. So I bought the flag and the pole and ordered them to be shipped to Cornwall, Connecticut. When we hailed a cab outside the store, Jack said, Let's go somewhere and grab a drink. It's only 11 o'clock, I told him. Let's go somewhere and grab a drink, he said again. And we did. December 18th, 11 a.m. Now that I know, or think I know, why I bought the flag and the flagpole, I have begun to worry about the effect they will have on my wife. She is used to getting things from me no larger than a woman's hand. I hope the pole doesn't upset her too much, the way the father in Barry's Mary Rose was upset when they told him his daughter had suddenly returned after 25 years in fairyland. I have been so occupied all my life with little things, was all that he could say. I don't want Helen to be stunned by a bolt from the red, white... I mustn't go on like this. 2 p.m. I finally told Ben Tuller, who does everything about my place from shooting crows to finding the coins I drop when I hang my trousers up, that I had bought a present for my wife that would probably arrive at the express office in 4 or 5 parts, 3 of them 6 feet long. I can get a couple of my wife's brothers to help me get it over here, he said, and maybe we can stow it in the garage till Christmas without Mrs. Thurber finding out, but I wouldn't count on it. Women have a way of knowing there are flags and flagpoles about. One thing I wanted to ask, how did you know it was a flag and a flagpole? I cut in. He stared at me. You told me yesterday, he said. Maybe I am losing my mind. I didn't remember telling him. What do you want to know? I asked. Before replying, he gazed out the window for a moment, and then, how do you aim to gift-wrap that pole? He asked. I hadn't thought about that. I simply hadn't thought about it. And even if I could wrap the 3 6-foot sections, even if there was that much tissue paper and ribbon in the world, Helen wasn't strong enough to unwrap them. I'll have to exchange it, I said. Maybe they haven't shipped it yet. I'll exchange it for something else. At Annan's? Asked Ben. All you could get in place of it, I should think, would be a 6-foot pole and maybe 4 more flags. I turned without a word and walked out of the room. 11:45 p.m. I can't go on with it. I'm not getting anything done. I just sit here and make occasional notes. A few minutes ago, my wife came into the room and said, What are you up to? There was that question again, that note of suspicion. I'm planning to overthrow the government, I said, by force if necessary. Then you'll need your rest, she said. Come on to bed. As patriotic as she is, like all persons born in Nebraska, she'd be the first to lob a grenade into a congressman's living room if I gave the word. She has what has been called the strong loyalty of the wife. I'm going to bed now, but that doesn't mean I'll sleep. December 19th. Well, the cat's out of the bag. This morning I got a letter from Annan and Company, and my wife, who always reads the mail to me, opened it and began to read it aloud. "No," I cried, but it was too late. The fat was in the fire. The letter follows in full, and will serve to authenticate these notes for such of my readers as may have suspected I didn't actually buy a flag and a flagpole, but was just making it up. Dear Sir, as per the request of our Miss Tal, we are pleased to inform you that the flag and the flagpole are already on their way to you. We wish to advise you, however, that we have billed you for an additional $3 due to the fact that Miss Tal erroneously charged you for the pole without the 22-karat gold leaf copper ball. This additional charge of $3 is for the gold leaf copper ball. Miss Tal was of the thought and opinion that you wanted the setup as displayed in the store, and the ball is being shipped with the flag and the flagpole. We trust that what we have done meets with your entire approval, and hoping to be of further service to you, we are very truly yours, Annan and Company, George Jameson. I told my wife the whole story, beginning with my phone call to Jack Howard. She was wonderful about it. "I'm really glad to know what it is," she said. "Mr. Purvis at the express office phoned this morning before you were up and said he had 2 packages for you, one of them more than 6 feet long and heavy. I've thought of everything from a croquet set to a collapsible dog kennel." She considered a moment. "The pole isn't luminous at night, is it?" she asked. "I don't think so," I said, "but we could train a spotlight on the flag at night." "No, we couldn't," she said. "It's going to be evident enough the way it is, what with that 22-karat gold ball." I began to breathe shallowly. $3 seems pretty darn reasonable for a 22-karat gold ball, I said. "Do you suppose they meant to say $300? My wife sighed. "Men shouldn't be allowed to shop alone," she said. It's dangerous." "No, it isn't," I protested. "Well, chaotic, then," she said. I settled for that. December 20th. Last night my wife woke me up long after midnight. It turned out she hadn't been able to get the 18-foot pole out of her mind. She had been lying there thinking about a lot of other things, too. "I was just worrying about what the neighbors will think," she said. "I can't very well explain to them why you bought the flag and the pole, because it's too complicated. I understand it, but they wouldn't. They would just think you were facetious or flippant, and you simply can't kid around about the American flag in a quiet, reserved New England community like this." I got up and lighted a cigarette. "I'm not kidding around," I said. "I love the flag. As garish as it has beauty, dignity, and even grandeur, and that is something of a miracle." "For heaven's sake," she said, "don't tell people it's garish." "What has happened to the time of man," I demanded, "when the possession of your country's flag is looked upon as subversive or something?" Helen sighed. "Well, anyway," she said, "we can't put it up in the snow. You'll have to wait till Flag Day." "When is Flag Day?" "April 14th, I think," I told her. "No, it's in June," she said. "I'm sure it's in June." We both felt that we had better check on it, that we had better know the day. "Of course," Helen went on, "it didn't help things when you and your daughter put those carbon copies of old letters to Harcourt Brace in one of Mr. Heston's pumpkins last year." I stamped out my cigarette. I know, I said irritably. "It didn't come off, but it was one of those things that seem like a good idea at the time. Anyway, we can forget about it until April." "June," said my wife firmly. "But it might be safer if we waited until the 4th of July. "Maybe it would," I agreed. "Not even a senator could find fault with a man who flies the American flag on the 4th. I got back in bed. Half an hour later, I spoke to her in the dark. "I was just thinking," I said. "I was just thinking that everybody will hear about this, and next December, Annan's will be just as crowded as every other store on Fifth Avenue. I've killed the goose that laid the golden ball. It's going to be terrible for me." "It's going to be wonderful for Annan's," murmured my wife. I couldn't tell whether she was awake or talking in her sleep. December 21st. This morning I asked Ben Tuller if he had told his wife's brothers about the flag and the flagpole. They didn't have to help me, he said. There were only 2 boxes, and I handled them myself. My face must have shown relief. I wouldn't tell anybody about this, he said. It's between you and me. You can count on that. I thought he sounded a little aggrieved. I never questioned your loyalty, I assured him. Of course, people are bound to see the flagpole sooner or later, he said. We'll face that problem when we come to it, I told him. Where is the stuff now? In the attic, he said. Do you want me to wrap the pole for you? No, I said. I've decided just to wrap the flag. I can do that myself. I started out of the room, but turned at the door. I suppose I should have married Barbara Fritchie, I said. Ben made no comment. Tonight I hope to sleep all the way through to the dawn's early light. Am I Not Your Rosalind? A rare find is an able wife, George Thorne recited. There are cigarettes in that box, Fred. I got some right here. Fred Stanton pulled a pack from his pocket. Thorne walked over, snapped his lighter, and held the flame for his guest. A rare find is an able wife, he began again. She rises early and pays off the servants and so on, but she invariably mucks up the cocktail hour. I'll stir up some more martinis for us. He went over to the bar. They'll be up there a good half hour. Let 'em catch up. Stanton watched his host's ritual with bottles, ice, and shaker. Lydia always shows her friends over the house, too, he said, even if they've seen everything 100 times. Pride of possession. Thorne stirred his mixture thoughtfully. These are my jewels, and so on. I gave Anne an old lace fan when we were in Rome before the war, too fragile to handle, so she's just had it shadow-boxed. That'll take up a good 15 minutes. Then there's the Landeck dry point in the hall up there. Thanks. Stanton studied the cocktail pouring into his glass. Thorne filled his own glass, set it and the shaker down, and went out into the hall and frowned up the stairs. I wouldn't yell at 'em, Stanton said. Women don't like to be yelled at. Anne, Thorne called. There was no answer, no sound from upstairs. Thorne came back into the room and picked up his glass. To the ladies, he declaimed. We can drink with 'em or without 'em. Women like to do things in the house their own way, Stanton brought out after some thought. That's a good cocktail. Thorne walked over and filled his guest's glass again. Okay? Perfect. Thorne refilled his own glass. You're oversimplifying a pretty profound difference, Fred. Did you ever see directors at a board meeting exclaiming over a perfectly darling new water cooler or a desk calendar just too cunning for words? Stanton stirred uneasily and recrossed his legs. How do you shadow-box a fan? He asked, after an obvious search for something to turn the conversation. You set it in a deep frame against a rose-colored background, Thorne explained. Effective and expensive. He glanced at his wristwatch and went out again to the bottom of the stairs. Hey, girls, he yelled. Anne, it's 7:30 for heaven's sake. A faint shut up drifted down from somewhere above. Stanton was sitting on the edge of his chair, looking unhappy, when his host came back saying, A woman should be yelled at regularly, like an umpire, to paraphrase Noel Coward. Clears the air. Here. Thanks, said Stanton. Anne snaps back. I'll mix some more. But what the hell? Are they dry enough for you? She's got temperament, you know that, but I like it. He went to the bar after swallowing his drink. Lydia's got temperament, too, Stanton said defensively. Seems awful calm and level-headed. Thorne poured the last measure of gin into the shaker. Lydia's got a lot of variety, Stanton said, sitting up straighter. Oh, sure, Thorne said, stirring. Lydia's a swell gal. Lydia, Stanton's left hand seemed to be trying to pull out of the air an instance of his wife's variety. Lydia played Rosalind in her senior class play when she was in high school, he said loudly, and apparently surprised at his outburst and embarrassed, he lit a cigarette with unnecessary care. Oh, that was 21 years ago in Binghamton. Played only one performance, of course. Every class... For God's sake, this is wonderful, Thorne cut in. This is really wonderful. Anne was Rosalind, too, in her senior class play in a high school in Nebraska. For God's sake, hold out your glass. Thanks, said Stanton. He had the expression of a man who has unwarily touched something old and precious, like an heirloom, and seen it suddenly fall apart. Both the girls were born in 1919, so they must have been ranting and posturing at practically the same time, Thorne cried. I don't know that we better mention it, Stanton said. You know how women are. Thorne laughed gleefully. What I want to find out is how women were, and I got just exactly the right thing. Do you know what a sound mirror is? Have you got one of those wire recorders? Stanton asked apprehensively. You could never get Lydia to talk into it. She'd never do that. Look, you get a Hambo high, any Hambo, and he'll act, Thorne chortled. After all, this was years ago, Stanton said. Here they come. Leave it to me. Thorne winked at him. If I were you, Stanton began. The two women came down the stairs and into the room, laughing and talking. You don't know what you've got coming to you, Thorne said. Fred, you simply must see the perfectly lovely fan George got Anne in Rome, Lydia cried. What's the matter? Are the drinks that bad? Anne asked her husband. The drinks are excellent, Stanton said. Excellent. Thorne went to the bar, chuckling. Has he rigged up a booby trap, or is he just merry and gay? Anne said to Stanton. What's the matter with you, Fred? His wife demanded. You look worried. Did Mickey Mantle die or something? George has been showing off, probably, Anne said. Thorne gave each of the women a glass and filled it up. No more for me, Stanton said, raising his hand. Come on, we're going to have toasts, old boy. Here. Thanks, Stanton sighed. I was doing that big scene of mine from a night at an inn, Thorne told his wife. George was all over the state in college, Anne said. He was picked as the man most likely to flop out of town. The two women laughed. Thorne grinned, and Stanton shifted in his chair. We are poor little hams who have lost our way, Thorne said, bowing to the women. Raise glasses. Lydia and Anne looked at him. Stanton stared at the floor. What are you mumbling about? Anne said. To the two fairest Rosalinds who ever strutted their little hour. George! Anne made a gavel rap of the name. Then suddenly the two women looked at each other. There was a swift, almost reflex interchange of appraisal. It was as if each had clicked on and off the searching beam of a flashlight. Did you play Rosalind, too? Anne cried. I'm afraid I did, Lydia laughed. They laughed together. I think Rosalind is really horribly boring, Lydia said. She looked at her husband, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. It's terribly hard to make her appealing, Anne said. She's like Diana of the Crossways in a way. Didn't you hate Diana of the Crossways? Thorne went around, draining the shaker, and moved tentatively to the bar. He could tell that it was all right to mix another round when Anne didn't say anything. Mickey Mantle isn't any tris speaker, but he's better than DiMaggio for my money, said Stanton. Rosalind is one of the first 10 aggressive ladies in literature. Thorne had no intention of letting Diana or Mantle sidetrack the topic of conversation. That's what makes her a hell of a challenge to an actress. Being aggressive, she's also gabby, and that makes it a fat part. George's descriptions are always so charming, Anne said. Any child in her teens could enchant the Parent-Teacher Association by being cute as a little red wagon, Thorne said. Oh, for God's sake, George. Anne spanked out a cigarette she had just lighted. Anybody can be precocious, Thorne went on. The real test comes in the years of maturity. I know what you're up to, but it isn't going to work. Anne turned to Lydia. He's got one of those damn recorders, and he thinks he'll get us a little tight and make us perform. You talk into it, a gadget, and zip, your voice comes out clear and perfect as a bell, George explained. Really? Lydia said. They used him in the Air Corps, Stanton put in. Combat reports, invented for that purpose. George will do a Jeter Lester for you at the drop of a hat, Anne said. And that big going-to-pieces scene from What Price Glory. Lydia, holding out her glass, laughed in a higher key than before. "Goodness," she said, "I haven't done a thing since college." "College?" Anne gave her the appraising glance again. "I don't know why Fred didn't bring it all out in his cups." Lydia gave a little disparaging laugh. "Yes, I did Nora in A Doll's House and Candida." "Well," Anne made a polite quaver of the exclamation. She held out her glass. A white-coated colored man appeared at the dining-room door. "Herbert, would you ask Florence if she'll give us 15 minutes more?" Anne said. He nodded and went away. "There are several makes, all of them hard to get," Stanton said, and coughed. "I simply didn't have the time for it in college." Anne waved it all away lightly with her left hand. "So many other outside activities." Lydia brushed from her skirt a thread that was not there. "Of course," she said quietly. Thorne stood grinning at his wife. "We'll have time for another quick round," she said. She looked coolly at Lydia. "The wine can stand a bit more chilling."